Nobody on that street expected it, but the husband didn't just ask his wife to step out. He dragged her. He grabbed her arm, pulled her across the seat, and dropped her existence on the pavement like it was something he could discard. Because his mistress was standing 10 feet away, waiting for their date, checking her phone like she owned his life. And from the front yard, his mother stood cheering, arms wide, voice loud, completely unaware that what she was applauding was the very act that was about to dismantle everything her son had ever built. But there was someone else watching, someone the mother had walked past every morning without a second glance, someone the husband had once tossed a dismissive look at from his car window. A poor, crippled beggar with hollow cheeks and a worn blanket, sitting on the corner of the same street day after day, unaware to everyone around him as anything more than a problem to ignore. Everyone ignored him, but the wife never did. She stopped every single day, fed him, sat beside him, asked how he was, not because it was convenient, but because she believed that every human being deserved to be seen. What she didn't know was that this man, this poor, crippled figure the world had written off, was a secret trillionaire, one of the most powerful men on the continent, who had shed his wealth like a costume to live among ordinary people and discover who carried real character in their hearts. And then he bought the company, the very company the husband worked for as a manager. His office, his title, his salary, his entire identity wrapped up in one building, now belonged to the man he had ignored on the sidewalk. When he saw the husband's cruel act, what he did shocked the wife to her core, but it was what she did next that will shake you. Dear viewers, what you're about to experience is more than a story. It's a mirror. This story will teach you that cruelty has a memory, kindness has a reward, and power never looks the way we expect it to. You'll walk away with a deeper understanding of character, consequence, and the courage it takes to choose dignity when life strips it from you. Watch until the very end. Then drop your biggest takeaway in the comments and tell me what you would have done if you were her. Subscribe for more stories that educate, inspire, and stay with you long after you've watched. The roses along Maplewood Drive were in full bloom that Tuesday morning, red and shameless against a sky so blue it almost looked painted. But nobody on that quiet suburban street was looking at roses. They were looking at Eleanor. Eleanor Whitfield sat on the cold pavement in a pale yellow dress she had ironed the night before, her palms bleeding from where the asphalt had kissed them as she fell. Her brown leather handbag lay 3 feet away, its contents, a lipstick, her phone, a folded grocery list, scattered across the ground like evidence of a life interrupted. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply looked up at the car, the silver car she had helped make the down payment on 3 years ago, and watched it like a woman watching a ship sail away without her. Inside that car, her husband Derek Whitfield adjusted the rearview mirror, not to check on her, but to check his own hair. Derek was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that always seemed clenched and eyes that had long stopped being warm. He had been a manager at Callaway and Reed Consulting for 6 years, a title he wore the way other men wore crowns. And this morning he wore it like armor. He didn't look back. Not once. The passenger door swung open, and Cassandra Vale slid in like she had rehearsed it. Cassandra was everything Derek had convinced himself he deserved. Polished, perfumed, laughing at things before they were even funny. She was his mistress, but she carried herself like a wife, and that distinction had never once troubled her. She leaned over and kissed his cheek before the door had even closed. Derek smiled, the kind of smile Eleanor hadn't seen in 2 years. But what Derek hadn't noticed, what Cassandra was too distracted to register, was the woman watching from the front yard. Gloria Whitfield stood at the edge of the driveway in a floral housecoat, her silver hair pinned back, her hands clapping together slowly, rhythmically, like she was sending her son off to war, and he had just won it. She was 64 years old, and she had never once questioned Derek. Not when he came home late, not when Eleanor's eyes grew hollow, not when the warmth drained slowly out of their home like water through cracked tile. Gloria had raised Derek to be a provider, a leader, a man. And in her mind, a man who knew what he wanted and took it was simply a man being a man. She didn't see Eleanor on the pavement. or perhaps she did, but she chose the story she preferred. Eleanor rose slowly, not because her body was ready, but because her pride would not allow the pavement to be the last word. She picked up her lipstick first, a small act but deliberate, then her phone, then the grocery list, which she folded carefully and pressed back into her bag with hands that trembled only slightly. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Paulson, 62, always gardening, had stopped watering her hydrangeas and was staring. Eleanor met her eyes briefly, then looked away. There was nothing to say that the pavement hadn't already said, but here is what neither Mrs. Paulson, nor Gloria, nor Derek would ever understand about Eleanor Whitfield. She had survived worse mornings than this one. Much worse. There had been a morning 4 years ago, when in the first winter of their marriage, when Derek had taken her savings, every dollar she had scraped together from 3 years of working double shifts as a pediatric nurse, and invested it in a deal that collapsed in 30 days. He had not apologized. He had explained. And Eleanor, who had loved him then with something close to recklessness, had quietly rebuilt. She always rebuilt. It was both her greatest strength and, she sometimes feared, the reason Derek had never stopped testing her. She turned now and walked, not toward the house, not toward Gloria, who was still murmuring something approving about Derek, but down Maplewood Drive, toward the corner where the old church wall met the sidewalk. Her feet knew the way before her mind had made the decision. Because even on mornings like this one, especially on mornings like this one, Eleanor Whitfield stopped for the man on the steps. He was already there. He was always there, wrapped in his gray blanket despite the warmth, his crutch leaning against the church wall, his tin cup sitting empty beside his right knee. His name, as far as Eleanor knew, was simply Walter. He had told her that on the third morning she stopped, and she had never pushed for more. He was perhaps 60, perhaps 70. His face was weathered in the way that distinguished suffering from time, and his left leg was visibly damaged, a deep scar running from his knee to his ankle, partially hidden by the blanket's hem. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out the small container she had packed that morning. Rice, slow-cooked chicken, and a small square of cornbread, before any of this morning's events had happened. She had packed it while Derek slept. She always packed it. She knelt beside Walter, placed the container in his hands, and for the first time that morning, her voice came back to her. "Good morning, Walter." He looked at her. Not at the food, not at her dress, not at the scrape on her palm that was still faintly bleeding. He looked directly into her eyes with a steadiness that had always unsettled her slightly, the way a deep river unsettles you, even when it is perfectly still. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. "You're hurt." She smiled the way people smile when they are trying to protect someone from the weight they are already carrying. "I'm fine," she said. But Walter's eyes moved slowly past her, down the length of Maplewood Drive, and out toward the spot where Derek's silver car had long since disappeared, and something passed across his face. Not pity, not surprise. Something older and heavier than either. Something that looked unmistakably like recognition. Eleanor didn't see it. She was already walking back toward the house, her grocery list back in her bag, her chin lifted just enough to keep the tears from falling. But Walter watched her go, and then he reached slowly into the folds of his blanket and pulled out a phone. Not a cracked, cheap phone, a sleek, matte black device that had no business being under that blanket. He made one call. It rang once. "It's time," he said quietly. "Move the paperwork. Calloway and Reed. Finalize it today." He ended the call, folded the phone back into the blanket, picked up his tin cup, and waited. The elevator doors at Calloway and Reed Consulting opened on the 14th floor with a soft chime that Derek Whitfield had long decided was the sound of arrival. His arrival, specifically. He stepped out ahead of Cassandra, straightened his tie in the reflection of the glass partition, and walked the corridor the way men walk when they have confused a title with a destiny. The office was all chrome and clean lines, the kind of space that was designed to make ordinary work feel important. And Derek moved through it like a man who owned it. He didn't own it, but he managed it. And for Derek, the distance between those two things had always felt negotiable. His name was on the 14th floor directory. His decisions moved budgets. His signature approved projects. In the ecosystem of Calloway and Reed, Derek Whitfield was the sun around which smaller planets orbited, and he had spent 6 years making absolutely certain everyone on that floor knew it. But there was something different about the office this Tuesday morning, something that registered at the edges of Derek's awareness without fully breaking through. Conversation stopped a half-second too long when he passed. Eyes dropped a fraction too quickly back to screens. Sandra from accounts, who always greeted him with the particular brightness of someone who wanted a favorable performance review, barely looked up from her desk. Derek noticed it the way a man notices a crack in the ceiling. Briefly, then not at all. He settled into his corner office, gestured for Cassandra to sit across from him, and reached for his coffee. When they had stopped at the cafe downstairs, the one Eleanor had introduced him to 4 years ago, a detail he had long since stopped registering, Cassandra was talking about a restaurant she wanted to try for dinner, somewhere new downtown, and Derek was half listening with the satisfied expression of a man whose morning had gone exactly as planned. It had not occurred to him, not once since Maplewood Drive, to wonder whether Eleanor had gotten up off the pavement. This is what Eleanor had always known about Derek, not the Derek he showed at company dinners or family gatherings, where he was charming and generous, and the kind of man who topped up everyone's glass before they asked. But the Derek behind closed doors, the Derek of small cruelties and convenient memories. She had known it since year 2 of their marriage. When she had come home from a double shift at the hospital to find him at the kitchen table, unbothered, while the pipes under the sink had been leaking for 3 days. He hadn't called the plumber. He had waited for her to notice. "I knew you'd handle it," he had said and smiled. And Eleanor, who was tired in the way that goes past the body into something structural, had called the plumber herself and said nothing. That was the year she had started getting up earlier. Not for Derek, but to walk, to breathe, to be a person before the day required her to be a wife. Cassandra's voice cut through the memory. "Derek, your desk phone has been ringing." He glanced at it. The small screen read, "Executive Floor, HR." Derek frowned. HR from the executive floor didn't call managers on Tuesday mornings. They sent emails, formal, in carefully worded emails that arrived on Fridays so the weekend could absorb the shock. He picked up. "Mr. Whitfield." The voice was professional, measured, the kind of voice that had delivered news like this before and had learned to do it without inflection. "Could you come to the 16th floor at your earliest convenience? Mr. Hargrove would like to speak with you personally." Derek straightened. Hargrove was the CEO, a man Derek had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 6 years, always at company events, always briefly. "Of course," Derek said. "Is there something I should—" "He'll explain everything when you arrive, sir." The line went dead. Cassandra raised an eyebrow. Derek set the phone down slowly, and for the first time that morning, the certainty he wore so comfortably shifted. Just slightly, just enough to feel. "Probably a budget review," he said, more to himself than to her. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the elevator with the same stride as before. But something in his jaw was different now. Something was working. The 16th floor was different from the 14th. Where the 14th was managed confidence, the 16th was earned quiet. Thick carpet, dark wood, artwork that nobody had bought to impress anyone. Derek stepped out of the elevator and was met immediately by Hargrove's assistant, a compact woman named Phyllis who had worked on this floor for 11 years and whose expression had never once been readable. "He's ready for you," she said, and opened the door to the boardroom. Derek walked in. Hargrove sat at the head of the table, silver-haired, 70, with the posture of a man who had made peace with gravity and won. Beside him sat 2 people Derek didn't recognize. A woman in a charcoal suit with a document folder in front of her, and a man in his 40s with the particular stillness of someone who carries authority so naturally he no longer needs to perform it. And at the far end of the table, in a chair positioned slightly apart from the others, as though by deliberate design, sat a third figure. Derek's eyes moved to him last, the way eyes always move last to the thing they aren't prepared to process. The man was perhaps 60, perhaps 70. He sat straight, straighter than Derek expected, in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that cost more than Derek's monthly salary. His hands were folded on the table. His left leg, extended slightly to the side, carried the faint trace of an old injury, a deep scar visible at the ankle where the trouser hem had risen slightly. Derek stared. He knew that scar. He had seen it every morning from his car window, wrapped in a gray blanket, propped against a church wall, attached to a tin cup and a weathered face, and a crutch he had once nearly run over pulling out of Maplewood Drive. The room tilted. "Mr. Whitfield," Hargrove said, with a tone that was not unkind, but carried no warmth either. "I'd like to introduce you to the new owner of Callaway and Reed Consulting. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the firm has been acquired." The woman in the charcoal suit slid a document across the table. At the top, in clean black letters, were two words: Weston Holdings. Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. While the man at the far end of the table, Walter Weston, looked at Derek with the same steady, river-deep gaze he used on the steps of the church every morning. But here, in this room, with that suit and that silence and the weight of 11 figures sitting invisibly behind his eyes, it was not the gaze of a beggar. It was the gaze of a man who had been watching, who had been waiting, who had seen everything. "Please sit down, Mr. Whitfield, Walter said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of someone who had long stopped needing volume to command a room. Derek sat, not because he chose to, but because his legs made the decision for him. "We have quite a bit to discuss," Walter said. And then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes moved to Derek's hand, specifically to the knuckles, where the faint imprint of a sleeve grab had left a small crease in the fabric. He had seen it on Maplewood Drive 45 minutes ago. Derek had not known anyone was watching, but Walter Weston had been watching Maplewood Drive, and Derek Whitfield, for much longer than this morning. He had watched Derek the way a man watches a storm he knows is coming, not with fear, but with the quiet preparation of someone who has already decided what he will do when it arrives. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Walter had first seen Eleanor 18 months ago, on a morning when the frost was still on the ground, and she had been the only person on that entire street who had stopped. Not just stopped, she had taken off her scarf and placed it over Walter's shoulders without asking, without hesitating, and without looking around to see if anyone was watching her be kind. That morning had cost Walter Weston nothing but a moment, but he had never forgotten it, and he never forgot a debt. Down on Maplewood Drive, Gloria Whitfield was back inside the house, humming to herself in the kitchen, completely unaware that the company her son had built his identity around had just changed hands. Completely unaware that the man she had walked past every morning, the one she had once told her neighbor was an eyesore on an otherwise decent street, was now her son's boss. She poured herself a cup of tea and smiled, thinking about how proud she was of Derek. The roses outside were still blooming, but the morning had already changed everything. Eleanor was on her knees in the garden when her phone rang, not because she had planned to garden that morning, but because after she had walked back from the church steps, after she had passed Gloria in the hallway without a word exchanged between them, after she had climbed the stairs and sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Derek for 7 years and stared at the wall long enough for the light to shift, she had come outside. The garden had always been Eleanor's place, not because Derek had given it to her, but because she had built it herself, one season at a time, in the stolen hours between shifts and silences. Every rose bush, every herb border, every carefully placed stone path was a decision she had made alone. It was, she had once realized with a quiet sadness, the only thing in her life that had grown entirely on her terms. She looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. A downtown exchange, clean and corporate. She almost didn't answer, but something in the persistence of the second ring made her pull off her garden glove and press the phone to her ear. "Mrs. Whitfield?" The voice was warm but precise, a woman's voice, unhurried. "My name is Diane Marsh. I'm the executive liaison for Weston Holdings. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Walter Weston." Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. "He's asked me to pass along a message," Diane continued. "He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'Tell her the scarf was never forgotten. and tell her she doesn't have to rebuild alone this time." The garden went very still. Eleanor stood slowly, her knees leaving two small impressions in the soft earth. The kind of impressions that would still be visible the next morning, long after everything else had changed. Her mind reached back 18 months to a frost-covered Tuesday when she had been running late for a shift and had taken the long way down Maplewood Drive for no reason she could explain, instinct or something older than instinct, and had seen a man shivering against the church wall with no blanket, no coat, nothing but a thin shirt between his skin and the cold. She had unwound her scarf without thinking. She hadn't asked his name that morning. She had just placed it over his shoulders and kept walking, already late, already tired, already carrying more than a person should carry quietly. She had never mentioned it to Derek, not because it was a secret, but because she had long since learned that Derek processed kindness as weakness, and she had stopped offering him things he would reduce. "Mrs. Whitfield?" Diane's voice came again, gently. "Mr. Weston would also like you to know that a meeting has been arranged at his request, at your convenience, at the Callaway and Reed offices. He believes there are matters that directly concern you, matters he would like to address personally." Eleanor looked across the garden, past the roses, past the stone path, to the front of the house where the driveway was still empty, where the concrete still held the faint shadow of the morning's events, the way concrete holds heat long after the sun has moved. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready," Diane said. "Mr. Weston is in no hurry, but he wanted you to know you have options, Mrs. Whitfield, more than you currently believe." At Callaway and Reed, the boardroom had emptied of everyone except Walter and Hargrove. Derek had been escorted, gently but unmistakably, to a waiting room on the 15th floor, where he sat with the particular stillness of a man whose architecture has just been questioned at its foundation. Cassandra had texted him twice. He hadn't replied. His coffee was cold on the table in front of him, and he was staring at it the way people stare at things when they are not seeing them at all. He was thinking about the man in the boardroom. He was thinking about the scar. He was thinking about the morning, the silver car, the pale yellow dress, the sound the pavement made. He was thinking with a creeping and unfamiliar sensation about whether those things were connected. But Derek was a man who had spent years building an internal architecture specifically designed to keep inconvenient connections from forming. And so the thought arrived and was dismissed before it fully assembled itself. But it came back. It always comes back. Back in the boardroom, Walter stood at the window, something he rarely did, because standing still at windows was something that required a particular kind of peace, and peace had taken him a long time to rebuild. Below, the city moved in its ordinary Tuesday rhythm. Taxis, pedestrians, a food cart trailing steam. From 14 floors up, the people looked small. Walter had learned over the course of a life that had swung between invisible and all-powerful that this was the great lie of altitude. That height made you larger. In truth, when the most important things he had ever witnessed had happened at ground level, on steps, on pavements, in the space between a person who had nothing and a person who chose to stop anyway. Hargrove spoke carefully from behind him. "The staff are expecting an address this afternoon. How would you like to handle Whitfield?" Walter turned from the window. "Not yet," he said. "There's someone else who needs to be in the room first." Hargrove nodded slowly. He had worked with powerful people for 40 years, and he had learned to recognize the difference between men who move quickly because they were reckless and men who move slowly because they were certain. Walter Weston was the second kind, the most dangerous kind. "The wife?" he asked. "Eleanor," Walter said. Not the wife, but her name, a deliberate and specific in the way that names become when a person has earned your respect. Yes, Eleanor arrived at Callaway and Reed at 12:30. She had changed from the pale yellow dress, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she refused to walk into whatever this was carrying the morning's damage on her body. She wore a deep blue blouse and dark trousers, and she had cleaned the scrape on her palm and covered it with a small bandage that she wore without hiding. She carried her leather handbag, repacked, reorganized, every item returned to its proper place. Phyllis met her at the elevator on the 16th floor with the same unreadable expression she offered everyone. But she held the boardroom door open 2 seconds longer than necessary, which was, for Phyllis, the equivalent of a warm embrace. Walter was already seated when Eleanor walked in. He was not in the same chair as before. He had moved to a chair in the middle of the table, closer to where she would sit, which was a small but deliberate act of equalization. He did not stand, his leg made standing slowly a process, but he straightened, and the straightening carried more dignity than most men's standing ovations. Eleanor stopped when she saw him, not because she hadn't expected it. Diane's call had prepared her for the fact of his presence, but because there is a difference between being told something and seeing it. The Walter on the church steps and the Walter in this room were the same man, the same eyes, the same scar, on the same steadiness. But the distance between the gray blanket and the dark suit was so vast that her mind required a moment to build the bridge. "Eleanor," he said, "please sit down." She sat. She did not look around the room. At the document folders, at the Weston Holdings letterhead, at the framed Callaway and Reed acquisition notice that had been placed deliberately at the center of the table. She looked at Walter. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a woman assembling facts in real time, with the precision of someone who had spent years learning to read the room she was in. "You knew who he was. You knew where he worked." "Yes," Walter said simply. "For how long?" Walter's hands folded on the table remained still. "Long enough," he said. "But I want to be clear about something, Eleanor. Before we go any further." He paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence mattered, and he was a man who did not spend important sentences carelessly. "I did not buy this company because of this morning. I bought this company because it was a sound investment. What happened this morning," his eyes moved briefly, barely perceptibly, to the bandage on her palm, "only confirmed what I had already decided about what happens next." Eleanor looked at the bandage, then back at him. "What happens next?" she asked. Walter unfolded his hands and opened the document folder in front of him. "That," he said, "depends entirely on you." Down on Maplewood Drive, Gloria's phone rang. It was Derek, calling from the waiting room on the 15th floor, his voice stripped of its morning's confidence, carrying something she had not heard in it since he was a boy, and the world had first refused to cooperate with his expectations. "Mom," he said, "I think I'm in trouble." Gloria set down her tea. "What kind of trouble?" There was a long pause on the line. The kind of pause that is not silence but the sound of a man trying to decide how much of the truth he can afford. "The kind," Derek said finally, "that I don't know how to fix." Gloria looked out the window at the empty driveway, at the roses, at the 2 small impressions still visible in the garden soil where Eleanor had knelt. For the first time that morning, for the first time in longer than she would admit, something shifted behind Gloria's eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but the first faint pressure of a question she had been refusing to ask herself for years. What if I cheered for the wrong thing? She did not say it aloud, but it sat down inside her and did not leave. The boardroom at 2 o'clock was different from the boardroom at 9:45. At 9:45, it had been a room of revelation, of documents sliding across tables, of a man's certainty dissolving under fluorescent light. But at 2 o'clock, it was something else entirely. The afternoon sun had shifted west and was coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows at an angle that laid long gold rectangles across the dark table. The kind of light that makes ordinary rooms look like they are being used for something that will be remembered. Every chair was occupied. Hargrove sat at one end. Walter sat in the middle. Eleanor sat across from him, her bandaged palm resting lightly on the table, her spine straight in the way that people hold themselves straight when they are determined not to let the room see the cost of being there. So Derek was brought in last. He walked through the boardroom door with the careful steps of a man navigating terrain that had, without warning, become unfamiliar. His tie was slightly loosened, a small dishevelment that on another day would have been unthinkable. And his eyes moved around the room the way eyes move when they are performing a rapid calculation of power. They landed on Hargrove, then on Walter, then on Eleanor. And there, for just a fraction of a second, that the room collectively noticed and nobody acknowledged, They stopped. Eleanor did not look away. She did not look down. She looked at her husband the way you look at something you have finally, completely and irrevocably understood. Derek sat. The room held its breath. Walter spoke first, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the particular weight of a man who has never needed volume. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I want to begin by being direct, because I find that directness, though uncomfortable, is the only currency that doesn't devalue over time." Derek nodded once, a reflex, not an agreement. "I have spent the last 18 months conducting what some people in my position call due diligence," Walter continued, "but what I prefer to call observation. I observed this company. I observed its people. I observed its leadership." A pause, brief, precise. "And I observed Maplewood Drive." The gold light moved almost imperceptibly across the table. Derek's jaw tightened. "I don't see what Maplewood Drive has to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Walter said, still quietly but with a finality that closed the interruption like a door. "Because what a man does when he believes no one important is watching is the most accurate data point available. It is more reliable than his resume, more honest than his performance reviews, more truthful than anything he has ever said in a room like this one." The woman in the charcoal suit, Diane Marsh, opened her document folder without being asked. Hargrove folded his hands. Nobody looked at Derek except Walter and Eleanor, and they were looking at him for entirely different reasons. Walter was looking at him with the steady clarity of a verdict already reached. Eleanor was looking at him with something that had moved over the course of this extraordinary day, past hurt, past anger, into a territory she did not yet have a name for, but which felt surprisingly like altitude, like standing on high ground for the first time after years in a valley. Weston Holdings has completed its acquisition of Callaway and Reed as of 9 this morning, Walter continued. As the new owner, I have full authority over all personnel decisions, effective immediately. He opened his own folder. "Mr. Whitfield, your position as senior manager is being restructured. The role, as it currently exists, will be dissolved." Derek's face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of responses that his features couldn't fully contain. Disbelief first, then the reflexive reach for indignation, then something rawer and less practiced underneath both. "You can't," he started. "It's already done," Diane said, sliding a document across the table. "Your severance package is outlined on page 3. It is generous, more generous than the circumstances require, because Mr. Weston asked that it be so." Derek stared at the document, then at Walter. Something was assembling itself behind his eyes. The morning's events, the boardroom, the church steps, the gray blanket, the tin cup, and the assembly was arriving, finally and irrevocably, at its conclusion. "You," he said. The word came out stripped of everything except recognition. "You're the—" "Yes," Walter said. The room was very quiet. "Every morning," Walter said, and his voice carried now something that had not been in it before. Not anger, not triumph, but the particular gravity of a man speaking from the deepest and most honest part of his experience. "I sat on those steps and I watched a street show me who it was. And I watched people who had everything walk past people who had nothing, and I watched what it did to both of them over time. I watched comfort become cruelty so gradually that the people doing it stopped being able to see it." His eyes held Derek's without mercy, but also, remarkably, without hatred. "And I watched one person on that street choose differently. Every single day, without an audience, without a reward, without any reason except that her character would not allow her to do otherwise." He did not look at Eleanor when he said it. He didn't need to. The room already knew who he meant. Derek looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, perhaps the first time in years, perhaps the first time ever in the way that truly counts, he saw her, not as a fixture, not as a convenience, not as a woman whose patience was a resource to be drawn from without replenishment. He saw her as a person who had been quietly extraordinary in a life that had systematically undervalued her, and the seeing of it arrived not as tenderness, but as something colder and more permanent. The specific grief of understanding what you had and recognizing, with total clarity, the precise moment you threw it away. "Eleanor," he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different now. Smaller, careful, like something he was afraid to drop. Eleanor looked at her husband for a long moment. The boardroom waited. Outside, the city continued its Tuesday rhythm, indifferent and ongoing. Somewhere on Maplewood Drive, Gloria Whitfield was sitting with a cold cup of tea and a question she couldn't put down. Somewhere downtown, Cassandra Vale was on her third attempt to reach Derek's phone, unaware that the coordinates of his life had shifted so completely that her calls were landing in a place that no longer existed. And Eleanor Whitfield, who had been dragged from a car that morning, who had bled on the pavement of her own street, who had knelt in her garden and stood in this boardroom and carried this day in a body that was tired, but had not once, stopped being dignified, made her unexpected move. She did not rage. She did not weep. She did not reach across the table and take everything the room was offering her as weapon. She opened her own bag, the brown leather bag, repacked and reorganized, and placed a single folded piece of paper on the table in front of Walter. Walter looked at it but did not touch it. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a proposal," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady and clear, the voice of a pediatric nurse who had delivered difficult news to frightened parents and learned that the most powerful thing a human voice can do is remain calm when everything around it is not. "I've been developing it for 2 years, a community healthcare initiative, specifically for underserved neighborhoods. The kind of neighborhoods—" She paused, and the pause was not for drama, but for precision. "Where people sit on church steps because they have nowhere else to go." Walter was still for a moment. Then he unfolded the paper. The room watched him read. His eyes moved across the page with the focused efficiency of a man who had read thousands of proposals and knew within the first paragraph whether the person who wrote it understood what they were talking about. He read to the bottom. Then he went back to the top and read one section again. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "You wrote this while you were still married to him?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the frank curiosity of someone recalibrating an already significant estimation. "I wrote it because it needed to exist," Eleanor said, "not because my circumstances were convenient." Walter set the paper down, folded his hands over it, a gesture that, in the vocabulary of men like Walter Weston, meant something specific and irrevocable. "I'll fund it," he said. Diane looked up from her notes. Even Hargrove, whose expressions were professionally managed, allowed one eyebrow to rise briefly before returning to its position. "Full funding," Walter continued, "and I'd like you to run it, as its director, under Weston Holdings' philanthropic arm, Hamat, with full operational independence." He said it the way people say things they have been waiting to say, not impulsively, but with the relief of a decision whose time has finally come. Eleanor looked at the paper on the table, at the bandage on her palm, at the window where the afternoon light was doing its slow, indifferent, magnificent work across the city. "Yes," she said. Derek left the boardroom with his severance documents and the particular silence of a man who has run out of performances. He stood at the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And while he waited, he thought about a pale yellow dress on gray pavement, and a woman who had packed a warm meal before any of it happened, and 18 months of mornings on Maplewood Drive that he had driven past without seeing. And he understood, in the specific, yet irreversible way that understanding arrives when it is too late to be useful, that the most powerful person in his life had never been him. Gloria called as the elevator opened. He let it ring. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that was cool and bright and full of the particular promise that early autumn carries in its air, Eleanor Whitfield walked down Maplewood Drive for the last time as a resident. 2 suitcases, the leather handbag. Her garden had been tended for the final time. Every rose dead-headed, every stone path swept, every herb border trimmed with the care of someone leaving something beautiful for whoever came next. She stopped at the church steps. The steps were empty, but there was something on the third step, left deliberately, placed with care. A folded gray blanket, clean and pressed, with a small card tucked into its fold. Eleanor picked up the card. It read in handwriting that was spare and certain. "You stopped. That was everything." Eleanor held the card for a long moment. The street was quiet around her. Somewhere behind her, the roses on Maplewood Drive were still blooming, red and shameless and gloriously indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them. She put the card in her bag, picked up her suitcases, and walked forward. She did not look back, but she was smiling. The real kind. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that grows in the same quiet conditions as every important thing that has ever lasted. The kind that had always been there, waiting for the right morning to be seen. My dear viewers, you just witnessed what happens when a life lived with quiet integrity meets a world that forgot to look carefully. Eleanor never performed her kindness. She never waited for applause. She simply refused, every single morning, in every small and significant way, to let the world make her someone smaller than she was. And the universe, which misses nothing, sent her exactly what she had been giving others all along. Someone who saw her. Derek had a title, a corner office, and a mother cheering from the driveway. But he had built everything on the wrong foundation. And foundations, no matter how confident they appear, always tell the truth eventually. This story teaches us that the people we overlook are often the ones holding our future. That cruelty witnessed is cruelty recorded. And that kindness given without expectation is the most powerful investment a human being can make. And that it is never too late, not for Eleanor, not for Gloria, perhaps not even for Derek, to understand what truly matters. Drop in the comments the biggest lesson this story taught you. And tell me, what would you have done if you were Eleanor in that boardroom? Would you have taken the offer? Would you have confronted Derek differently? I want to know. And if this story moved you, taught you something, or made you think, please subscribe, because every week there is another story waiting, powerful, human, and true in all the ways that matter most.